Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Red Gaming Tech video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news, which as usual, has popped up the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully, you're having an amazing day. We have lots of stuff to get through in today's video, but I'd like to begin alphabetically with Intel, because there is something afoot at Intel, and it may be that Intel will no longer be utilising just its own manufacturing capacity, but instead outsourcing to other manufacturers, including TSMC. Intel's 10nm and 7nm processors have become somewhat of a meme of late, and Intel themselves had to admit that they've been facing yet more delays for some of their CPUs. But there is a fascinating report from China Times as well as DigiTimes. I'm going to read out a translation from the DigiTimes article. This was translated by the retired engineer over at Twitter, and so I'll link both Chia's Twitter profile as well as the report in the description. Worth noting is, according to the sources to the semiconductor industry, the volume for Intel's GPU outsourced to TSMC in 21, Ponte Vecchio, is not high, and should be using the lower cost 6nm process. For CPUs, plans for cooperation at 5 and 3nm nodes are currently in progress. On the whole, although TSMC has made further inroads into securing Intel's foundry outsourcing orders, the real volume will not happen until the second half of 2022, and this will mainly be for Intel CPUs. As for GPUs introduced in 2021, if they are unable to compete favourably against Nvidia and AMD, Intel may once again need to withdraw from the market, in which case there are no orders to talk about. I think it's imperative, before we go further, to just tackle one elephant that's in the room, and that is size comparisons for the different nodes. Intel's 10nm process, flawed as it may be, is actually better than TSMC's 7nm process, and it's more in line with 5nm plus or 6nm, which is obviously pretty damn impressive. And what's quite interesting is that we have DigiTimes as well as China Times, which are both corroborating with one another. And if this is true, it would be a massive change in strategy for Intel in how they are dealing with the future. And I do feel that Intel would take a bit of a slap to the face in terms of their pride, but honestly, I think it could be worth it. Just for competitiveness sake. I will also point out that it's not easy to simply change from one process to another process if they're produced from a different company. They have to do a lot more than just copy and paste it into Photoshop and then resizing it. And therefore, because of that, this is one of the reasons when they were initially, there was a rumour, I think it was late last year, early this year, that Intel would be outsourcing the production of some of its chips to TSMC, which were going to be basically helping them produce chips for the 14nm process. I was somewhat sceptical because it's not easy to do that. It's not, one manufacturer, has unique characteristics of their own node, which you're basically designing the chip around. It's going to be fascinating if this is true, because obviously we've also seen rumours that Nvidia are going to perhaps shift the production of their GPUs to the Samsung 8nm process. AMD for the next year or so will be continuing to use the 7nm process. Obviously we've got Zen 3, albeit on an improved process, but after that, TSMC will also be shifting to 5nm, and Apple, of course, as well, are moving away from the 7nm process. All of this is probably bloody good for TSMC, but as I mentioned in a video that I put out yesterday with some exclusive information for the next generation of server CPUs from AMD Milan as well as Zen 3, I'm hearing that AMD's performance per watt in particular is something that Intel needs to be very concerned about with Ice Lake X. As I said, I went over that more extensively in yesterday's information, but this is something that AMD obviously are going to be holding over Intel for some time. And so Intel, recently their stock prices have gotten absolutely battered. It's like, it feels like Bizarro World that AMD are actually above Intel in terms of stock valuation, in terms of how much the actual share is worth. It's weird, considering that it wasn't long ago, in the grand scheme of things, that AMD were trading at just a few bucks a share, and actually were so close to going bankrupt. I honestly, for a while, was seriously concerned that AMD would be going bye-bye. Like, they were so close to going bankrupt. It was ridiculous. So to me, it's going to be very interesting to see this role reversal over the next few years, and also how AMD will be competing in the GPU arena. Perhaps one of the biggest tragedies of this current generation was Silent Hills. There was so much anticipation and hype for that game, and then obviously Konami were Konami. And then we got nothing. But there is a fascinating story that's floating around the internets currently, with Hideo Kojima apparently in talks with Junji, who is very well known in the horror industry, about potentially a new horror game. Now, obviously you should treat this as a rumour, but according to Junji, he said, and I quote, "I do know that director Kojima and we have been in a conversation that he may have a horror-based game that he may be doing, and so has invited me to work on that, but there's no details as yet." There's not much other than this. I mean, even the language he's using is non-committal. It sounds like, at least if he's being accurate in the interview rather than not just teasing, and by which I mean, rather than him confirming that he already knows the full plot of the game, instead he's just saying, yes, maybe I'll work on it, so just kind of tease people a little bit. But either way, he's using very non-committal language. Now, if this is true, and I stress the word if, it would be interesting to see what the two of them come up with. It wasn't long ago, it was April actually, that Kojima himself made several comments and teases that he would like to make a horror game. In fact, he stressed it wanted to be some type of revolutionary type of horror game. And while I admit Death Stranding wasn't my cup of tea, I know, but, not every game's for everyone. It's hard to deny that Hideo Kojima himself has a very lofty career, and games like Metal Gear Solid and even Zone of Enders were pretty damn amazing. So hopefully this is true, as I would actually really like to see what Hideo Kojima would do with a horror game, especially when working with someone like Ito. It'll also be interesting to see if Sony continues their exclusivity with Kojima. Well, I guess not 100% exclusivity, it's console exclusivity, since obviously you can play Death Stranding on the PC too, or whether Microsoft get to play the game, or maybe the game is actually exclusive to the Microsoft platform, which would be pretty damn interesting. And now we're going to mosey our way to Sony. There is a small update for Project Athia, and this is by Luminous Productions, of course, Square Enix, as Yosoko Masuda, hopefully I've pronounced that correctly, from Square Enix, has actually been discussing a little bit about this game. The game, Project Athia, title obviously is not finalised yet, which will be released for the PS5, is an open world style game in which users can move around freely around the game world. PS5 dramatically improves video technology, such as the implementation of light reflecting ray tracing, compared to what you see on the PC. It's nearly identical. By using these special traits, we're able to create incredibly precise imagery. We still have plans on developing well-balanced games tailored to the platform's traits, including smartphone and cloud-based games, but we're never going to stop developing for high-performance platforms such as the PS5, because these things are packed with the best technology. What I find interesting here is this is further confirmation, although we basically knew this anyway from patents, that in terms of hardware-based ray tracing, the PS5 works almost identically to Nvidia's technology, albeit with some changes. Unfortunately, the patents are not 100% conclusive, but basically speaking, the GPU still works on BVH, bounding volume, hierarchy structures, which are accelerated thanks to the inclusion of an RT core, which handles, as I mentioned, the actual intersections of rays between different elements on the screen. From what Mark Cerny stated in the Road to PS5 presentation, though, while BVH is being calculated, other things can be done on the CU. So despite the fact that RT cores are directly part of the CU itself, the CU is also able to do other things while BVH is being run. It's going to be fascinating, honestly, to see what this means for games in the future. From obviously some games, we've seen limited RT being implemented. In other games, it's going to be a full ray tracing fest. And naturally, there are other alternatives as well, such as the real-time global illumination that we've seen demoed extensively in Unreal Engine 5 with the Lumen demo, which I've done a fairly in-depth analysis. Although that is real-time global illumination, which is a little bit different from the per-pixel lighting of hardware-based ray tracing that we've seen, for example, with Control on the PC. This is pure speculation on my part, but I do wonder if certain games will support both, and depending whether you go with performance type of settings or high fidelity, the ray tracing itself will change, or perhaps just in general, there will be a mixture of ray tracing and different lighting techniques, I feel, for the next generation anyway. While we're on the subject of the PS5, a small thing concerning the possible ability to customize, well, I suppose the wings are the best way of describing the PS5 case. It looks like you can snap off, basically, the sides of the case to change the color scheme or aesthetics of the case as you would so desire, which I can kind of get behind. I know not everyone's necessarily a fan of how either next generation console looks. Personally, I'd slightly prefer the Xbox look, I think. Although, it's kind of like, well, I'll be honest, I'm like the worst judge ever of the aesthetics of a console, because I like the original Xbox aesthetic. I owned one of the crystal ones, and I even like the PS3 aesthetic, so I don't know. I guess I can't really judge on that. But either way, it would be cool if you could customize it somewhat, and I imagine that this will also spur secondary businesses perhaps to open up and do 3D printing of custom designs, which honestly could be pretty cool, because we can't see whether you can actually look at the internals if you take the side off, or whether perhaps there's some like metal sheeting or something else, which I imagine there would be. But if not, if you could get some clear plastic or something so you could see the internals of the system, that would be pretty awesome. Anyway, it's just a small thing, but a number of you sent me this and I thought I'd cover it. And the final thing for the PlayStation, and that is how much mind share that Sony actually have with so many gamers. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, honestly. I think that, and I keep saying this, having a lot of competition in the market is always a good thing. But it's hard to deny that in certain markets in particular, Sony have just a ridiculous amount of mindshare. I think that Microsoft's plan in the longer term to get more Japanese developers on board will help. After all, we've already seen a couple of examples of that, like Phantasy Star, and recently Square really getting on board with even Dragon Quest coming out on the system, and tons of games like Final Fantasy coming to Game Pass. But Sony, for now, are still showing that, in the minds of gamers anyway, they definitely build hype. And honestly, hype is something that Sony have been doing for years extremely well. Even back in the PS2, all of the conversation was around the Dreamcast, and then Sega basically just died a death within what feels like minutes after Sony announced the PlayStation 2. And I still, honestly, am sad about that, because I feel that the world would be very different in terms of gaming if Sega was still involved, but that's an entirely different question. Anyway, getting back to what I was saying, according to the Chief Financial Officer over at Twitter, Ned Seagal, hopefully I've pronounced that correctly, we have seen an absolute massive spike in video game conversation on Twitter. It's an 89%, which is, well, not exactly small. And according to him, Sony not only found a way to connect to its customers, but also the PS5 campaign has managed to harvest over 1 million tweets and mentions over just 2 days in the late first quarter, which, according to Twitter's own engagement rates and metrics, which we don't really have full insight into, that is about 4 times higher than Twitter's own internal normal benchmarks, which is kind of crazy, honestly. And this actually matches very well with one of my own leaks from a while ago now. And that video was why Sony have not shown the PlayStation 5. And in that video, I mentioned a plethora of different things. One being that at the time, the software Sony did not feel was ready to show off in like large snippets of gameplay. They wanted closer to final code, I guess you could say, rather than needing to divert developers to crafting, well, I guess you could say vertical slices of gameplay, which would take developer time away from actually creating the full experience, because demos can take quite a while, especially, for example, if certain sections of the game are not ready to be shown yet, or perhaps they need to implement better lighting or whatever. That can take away development time, which can slow down the actual release of the game itself. And there were other reasons as well. Sony wanted to show the games, with the PlayStation 5, the console, and obviously all of that turned out to be true. But one of the things that I mentioned in that video is that Sony knew when they were hyping the system, it was all part of their marketing strategy. Basically, they made people as hungry and thirsty for information as possible. They basically drip-fed the information to people, and it's really good information control. I don't necessarily agree with all of the stuff that Sony is doing for this next generation. Like, I really don't like, for example, backwards compatibility and how Sony are handling that for the PS5, and I'll actually cover that in a separate video. I have to say, I really like the way that Microsoft are being much more inclusive, for example, in its backwards compatibility strategy, and with that, they even allow you to run certain games in HDR, which I think is fantastic. But it's hard to ignore the fact that the PlayStation 5 is quite honestly going to be a marketing juggernaut. It's going to be fascinating to see how the next couple of years in gaming change. And I also am very curious to see what happens with Nintendo and what happens with their strategies going forward with the Switch and perhaps other future systems. Anyway, with that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. The normal stuff: like, share, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.